live stream this like a council meeting so that anyone can watch right now if they know it's happening, or come back and watch it in the future. So there's a sign-up sheet that's been passed around, and y'all have gotten it already. Okay, you want to just make sure you're signed in, and we will get started. So my name's Nicole Elko. Hopefully I've introduced myself to everyone, maybe not yet, but I'm the city's coastal management consultant, and I am a trained coastal geomorphologist. That's my background. I was also on my PhD committee, was actually one of the founding fathers of coastal engineering, Dr. Bob Dean from Florida, so I have a lot of engineering training as well. I'm going to be sharing some of that with you today with this course called Beaches 101. We're going to learn a lot of scientific terminology, so I hope you have your notebooks. If you don't have them, make sure you get them out. If you need a pen and paper, let us know. We'll be learning some interesting things you might want to remember today. And it's going to help us understand beach erosion, which is really the thing that we are trying to manage, and actually have done a really good job managing it on Folly Beach. So you'll learn about the scientific processes and the political and human elements, which are really another important part of the process here. I first taught this class on Folly Beach in 2013. I've been doing this for 13 years with y'all, and it was really fun to go back through my slides from those early ones, because I challenged the city on some things, and it's been really nice to kind of walk through time and see how far we've come. So I'm excited to share that with you today. All right, so just kind of a little bit of motivation of why we're doing this. Why do we care about beach erosion? Why do we want to preserve beaches? I think that you all know this, but I want to let you know. I just want to remind you why we do it. We do it for 3 reasons. For storm protection, to increase our resilience. For the economics and recreation element, I think you all recognize very well how much money that beach is bringing in. Without the beach, the city would not exist as we know it today. We wouldn't have the budget that we have. And then obviously the environmental enhancement element. The turtle team here is excellent at communicating the need for a beach, for habitat. But it's the storm protection part I really want to stress right now. And so as the beach is out there, it's making money right now, right? People are coming, it's generating income. But what it's also doing at the same time is it's diverting damages. So this picture here is from a Florida hurricane back in 2004, where there was no restored beach out in front of this part of the community. 1 mile down the beach, there was a big restored beach, no damage whatsoever. And we see this repeated over and over again throughout the southeast. So while your beach is generating revenue, it's also helping you not spend millions of dollars in recovery damages. So it's a really important reason that we preserve beaches. And then this quick story to I'll just set the stage here is that obviously property value increases. So Folly Beach went through a story very similar to many communities around the country, and the most famous one is the one at Miami Beach. So Miami had some really poorly sited coastal development back in the 1970s. You can see from the picture, they actually reclaimed 10 feet of beach and built a bunch of seawalls so they could put their pools out next to the beach. This came back to bite them, and by 1970, there was a Time magazine article focused on Miami Beach, and Time called South Beach a seedy backwater of debt-ridden hotels. The mayor was quoted in that issue saying, business was so bad he was happy just to see prostitutes. Right, so it gives you an idea. And you know, Folly got to a bad state like that as well. When the beach goes, so does the economy. Property values in Miami Beach today, since the Beach Nourishment Project has been constructed, as you all know, have skyrocketed, and tourism as well. So this is a kind of dated statistic, but it shows that even back in 1983, more people went to Miami Beach on any single day than the combined number of visitors at our 3 most popular national parks. So yes, we need to preserve beaches, and we need to learn about why we're doing this. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today, we're going to have kind of 3 little mini courses. Sometimes I teach this course over the course of like 4 days. We're going to do it in about an hour and a half this morning. First, we're going to talk about processes and features, so that's sort of the science portion of the talk. Then we'll talk about human modifications, and kind of this is why beach erosion is happening. Then we'll talk about the beach preservation spectrum. So this is how we address erosion, how we're going to help to address the erosion that's happening. So starting out with processes and features, first I just want to very quickly remind you about waves and tides. So the tide itself is nothing more than a giant wave that's moving around the earth, Okay, so it's the bulge that's being pulled by the moon, essentially, and the sun somewhat, and that bulge circles as we rotate around the Earth about once a day, and that's why we see two tides here. When the moon and the sun line up, we get our spring tides or our king tides. When the moon and sun are opposite, we get neap tides. That's the lower tidal ranges you see every 2 weeks. These processes are going to become very important later in our conversation. That's why I want to remind you of them. This is the most important one. So waves, what you see at the top of the page is simply the basic terminology, the crest and the trough, the height of the wave, and the length of the wave. What I want you to focus on is this center diagram, which shows you that in deep water, the energy under the wave is more moving in an orbit. This is linear wave theory, or those are called orbital wave velocities. It's how the energy is transferred. And out in the middle of the ocean, the wave is just like the wave in a stadium. Nothing is actually moving except energy. The water particle is just going up and down like the person standing up and down, okay? So no mass is transferred. It's just energy. However, once the wave starts to come to shore, you can see it says waves feel bottom and steepen. So the waves get taller and taller until the energy overcomes them and they break, okay? What I want you to notice on the bottom figure is the longer the wave period, so the longer amount of time it takes for one crest to pass and then the second crest, the more stretched out that orbit underneath the wave becomes. And we're going to learn about why that's important. I'm going to pass this jar of sand around. It's kind of drippy right now, but if you shake it up and you wait and see what happens, try not to get wet, I want you to think about what the sand under these waves is doing as we get to the coastline. So just pass that around. Sorry, so it's this combination of waves and tides that create beaches, and it's just a little bit of background, scientific background for us to be reminded of as we go through this. So in the middle of the ocean, the tides, as I told you what the waves are doing out there, the tides are also ranging only about 1.5 feet in the middle of the ocean. Okay, 1.5 foot is the tidal range out in the middle of the ocean. So why is the worldwide average tidal range 6 to 10 feet? I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions today. Hopefully this is interactive. Any ideas? Why is the tidal range at the beach exactly the slope? So we mentioned the tide's actually a slow-moving wave, and we just learned that waves shoal and steepen as they come close to the beach. So does the tide. So the tide is actually getting steeper as it comes across the shallow continental shelf. What you see there, as you might know this, we are physically located within what's called the Georgia Bight. So that's this wider, let's see if this pointer works. Yeah, the continental shelf is much wider off of Charleston than it is, say, off of the Outer Banks. So the tide has a lot longer time to feel the bottom and to steepen. That's why we have much larger tidal ranges here than we do
Say that again.
in Cape Hatteras. So on the previous slide, we talked about how here the waves feel the bottom of the ocean floor and they steepen and break. The tide does the same thing. So because the tidal, or the continental shelf is so wide off the Georgia Bight, the tide, which is a huge wave, so it reaches very deep with its orbit, is dragging along the continental shelf, and it's actually steepening as it comes into Charleston. That's why our tidal range is so much higher than it is, say, in the Outer Banks.
Go around to the other side of Florida on the Panhandle. What's the tides up
Yep,
there?
we're going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
There are tides there, and it's an interesting comparison. I will be doing a lot of comparisons in the next few minutes between the Outer Banks and South Carolina. So remember the width of the continental shelf there. So now let's talk about waves. So this is actually the wave forecast for next week in these 3 locations. And the energy that's coming in here is pretty much the same, the wave energy. But see, the waves of the coastline are all very different, okay? Again, the reason being that the wave energy now is getting reduced. It's getting dampened because it's traveling across that long Georgia Bight, right, along this wide continental shelf. Whereas at Cape Hatteras, the wave energy is there, and it's going to peak up and it will retain its energy longer and crash onto the shore. That's why the waves are bigger in the Outer Banks than they are here. And then down in Florida, not only do you have a wide continental shelf, but you have the Bahama Bank and all this other stuff in the way, so they tend to have smaller waves there. All right, now this is, I'm trying not to get too sciencey on you, but this is one I do want you to understand. And this is why the barrier islands, right, we're talking about tides and barrier islands, the two processes, are so much different in the Outer Banks than they are here in Charleston, for example. Because barrier island formation, which Folly Beach is a barrier island, right, is determined by the relative influence of waves and tides. So if you have very high waves, this doesn't want to work. Yeah. If you have very big waves, so you're over on the right side here, and small tides, you're going to be in what's called a wave-dominated coastline, right? See the wave dominant. So big waves, small tides. The farther you go up this graph, as tidal range increases, you can see we go into what's called mixed energy tides, and then we get to this line where it says limit of barrier island formation. The tides get so significant that beaches don't exist, okay? And that's because waves create beaches, and if there's too much tide, you're not going to have beaches. So what does that look like? This is a wave-dominated coast. So again, we're using the Outer Banks as the classic example of a wave-dominated coast where waves are bigger than tides. You end up with these long barrier islands, lots of overwash, and very few tidal inlets. So you get this long, skinny situation with a big bay, a broad, shallow bay behind it. That's the Pamlico Sound. And it ends up being a sand-starved situation because the tidal inlets aren't there to kind of move sand in and out, and all the sand is overwashing the islands. So we have this dramatic difference in the geomorphology. This is what the barrier islands and beaches look like here in South Carolina. We have, no, there we go. We have a mixed energy coast, so we have a much greater tidal range, which means we have a lot more tidal inlets. The tide has to go in and out somehow, so it goes in between, it breaches the islands and creates all of these inlets. Because of having many tidal inlets, waves are still important, right? We're not tide dominated, we still have waves creating our beaches, but we end up with these short, stubby barrier islands. They're called drumstick barrier islands, and that's because they kind of resemble a chicken drumstick. They're skinny on one end and bulbous on the other end. Behind us, instead of a bay, we have this marsh and creek system because of our tidal energy, and we end up being in actually a very sand-rich environment, whereas the Outer Banks and mixed energy coasts are sand-starved. We actually are lucky and have quite a bit of sand.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So, what affects the tide in the river
Mm-hmm.
is always running hot. I mean, whether it's coming in or out, it is at a fast pace all the time. This energy that you're speaking of, is that what causes it, or is
Sure, yeah. There's just because our tidal range is so high, we don't really have any time for, we have a lot of time for it to rush in, and then, okay, let me say that again. We have to get a lot of water in and out of the river in one tidal cycle because we have such a high tidal range. So that's why it's coming in hot and going out hot, because there's so much volume of water is coming in and going into that constricted area in a short amount of time.
It just runs quick.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, so let's review the science part of the discussion. So, like, we have wave-dominated beaches in the Outer Banks, right? Mixed energy beaches here in Charleston. So where are the tide-dominated beaches?
Southern ones.
Yeah, there actually aren't any, okay? So tide-dominated beach is a trick question. There is no such thing as a tide-dominated beach, right? And again, the reason is that the beaches need the waves to push the sand up there and hold it on the beach. So if we go to a part of the country, which someone just asked about this, we're looking now in what's called the Big Bend region of Florida. So it's like that armpit of Florida, Cedar Key area, Hurricane Alley. Pasco County, Florida is an example. This is a tide-dominated coast, all right? Tides are much, much larger than waves. Tides aren't very big here, but there ain't any waves at all, so they just don't have beaches. There's just not that energy to push sand up onto the coastline, okay? So that is a very too fast primer about how tides and waves create barrier islands.
So let me ask you to recap.
Yes.
Tides create beaches, waves create beaches, tides do not.
That's right. If you have all tide-dominated energy and no waves, then you are not going to have a beach. So this diagram shows that if you have a very high tidal range, then beaches can't exist. Okay. And now we'll talk more about waves and how they actually form beaches. So first, we'll talk quickly about how waves are formed. Waves are formed by wind blowing over water. The energy from the wind is transferred into the water. And I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but the development and growth of the waves are governed by the factors of wind speed, wind duration, and fetch, the distance over which the wind is blowing. What the pictures shown here are of storm or wind waves. This is how all waves start out. They're created by the wind and they're a mess. This is called a confused sea. So it hasn't had time for the energy to spread out and clean up. So as the waves progress, the period starts to carry them away from their point of formation, and the faster waves kind of get out in front of the slower storm waves, and that's where you have a situation like this begin to occur. These are swell waves. So these are the ones that we like as surfers. And these waves are now nowhere near their point of formation. They have traveled long distances. They have grouped together, and now they're forming and they're running out ahead of the pack, as we say. Why is this important for you? Because of hurricanes are one of our biggest coastal change factors here in Folly Beach. So as a hurricane, if we like them when they just stay offshore and they go by us, because all they send us is this, which is great for surfing, and it's actually great for beaches. Where's our sand jar? Okay. So remember that orbital velocity under the wave we talked about. When waves are longer period, so there's more space in between each wave crest, remember the orbit is more oval shaped, whereas the high steep waves have a round orbit, okay? As we saw here with this drippy jar, what is happening with the sand? It is settling out. But you see what happens is that the coarse sand, the heavy stuff, the rockier, bigger grains are falling out right away, and then the muddier stuff, the finer grains, are slower to fall out. So as that orbit moves under the wave, and the waves are pushing sand on shore, that's how beaches are formed, the orbital velocity starts moving forward, and that's when all the sand drops out, right? The sand gets churned up into the water column, just like we saw there. The orbital velocity throws the sand forward, the big sand falls out, and then it pulls back as that slower sand is sort of, finer sand is settling out. So that's why you end up with coarse sand up on your beaches and sort of finer sands that move offshore. Okay, so that's the critical science information about how beaches are formed by waves. These types of waves are called constructive waves. So we just because what have I just described, right? They tend to move sand onto shore. The waves we saw in the previous picture, the storm waves, they're called destructive waves because there's not enough time for the sand to be deposited in that quick circle. Okay. The other thing I want you to notice about this picture is the angle of approach. So what angle are these waves approaching the beach? Right, they're coming straight on. There is no angle to this, and that becomes important as well as our conversation continues. Okay, so now we finally have enough information we can start talking about beaches. This is the cross-section of the beach. Most of the beach is underwater. It's like an iceberg. You can't really see most of the beach. And profiles look different around the world depending on the sediment size, the sediment supply, and the wave energy, like we just talked about. If you go to the Outer Banks where they have coarse sand and big waves, their beaches are going to be very steep. If you come here to South Carolina, the beaches will look more like this. We have finer sand and smaller waves, so therefore we have a flatter profile. In the summertime, so you see these two different lines. There's the black line that it goes on the top of the sand, and then there's this red dashed line. The black line is our fair weather profile. That's what's happening in the summertime. We just have sort of clean energy waves coming in constructively, pushing sand up onto the beach. Then in the wintertime, we get to our storm profile, or whenever, hurricane season, maybe it could happen during the summer. But that's when these destructive waves are carrying sand offshore, right? The sand doesn't have enough time to fall out of suspension moving forward, so it has to wait till the backside of that orbit and it gets taken offshore. And then recovery will follow, right? That beach erosion doesn't persist. This is a process. Fair weather, storm weather, it goes back and forth, right? There's no erosion happening here. The other thing I want to point out on this diagram is, see where it says high water, where the water and the swash zone are intersecting with the beach? That's our mean high water line. That becomes a very important point because that, in many areas, is the property line. If If there's no other platted line or regulatory line that exists, then the property owner owns down to mean high water, okay? So a little bit of politics creeping in here already, I can't help myself. The last thing related to beaches that I want to talk about is longshore current and longshore sediment transport. So in this case now, we're going to move away from the basic waves coming onshore not at an angle and talk about waves that are coming onshore at an angle. The coastline of South Carolina looks like this, right? In the Outer Banks, it's straight. So that means that no matter the angle, if waves are coming in straight, it's still hitting us at an angle. If they're coming in from up here, it's hitting us at a really big angle. So it's only when we get waves from the south that tend to be a little bit more straight on shore. Because of that, we have a significant longshore current here in South Carolina. So you ever go for a swim, especially during a little bit of a storm, there is a lot of energy moving in the surf zone, right? It's hard to stand, you're getting pulled along shore, and that energy is called the longshore current. If you swim out beyond it, there's much less energy going on out there. So where the waves are breaking is where all the transport is happening. So that's our longshore current, and that's where the sand movement occurs. Because the waves break, they stir up the sand, and then they're kind of moving the sand along shore. All right? This is a very fast summary of beach processes. I apologize. The last thing I want to talk about here is now we're going to relate the longshore current back to our conversation about tides and barrier islands. I'm going to talk about sand bypassing. So what you see here is a model of what I've told you before, the drumstick barrier islands that are common here in South Carolina. This was actually developed by a famous coastal geomorphologist, Miles Hayes. He trained Tim Kana, if any of these names are familiar to you. So a lot of the science on drumstick barrier islands was done right here in South Carolina, which is exciting. So what happens here is, as I mentioned, that waves are almost always approaching us at an angle. I want you to notice that big pink blob out there. That's called an ebb tidal delta, all right? It's a delta, like, you know, Mississippi Delta, any kind of hydrodynamic river is creating deltas. This is created by the ebb of the tide. So it's an ebb tidal delta, and it's a very important feature in understanding beach management. What happens as the waves come in and hit that ebb tidal delta is longshore sediment transport's happening along the outer edge of that pink delta, and eventually we have a sediment transport reversal. So this doesn't happen along South Carolina coast very often because of our angle. The sand is pretty much always going that way, but at the inlets it comes back in, and we have a reversal in sediment transport as the sediment is coming on shore. And what this results in are these beach ridges growing on the updrift of that bulbous drumstick barrier island. And it kind of starves the south end of the island because some of that sand gets trapped, and that's how you get the skinny stick of the drumstick. This is a great model that shows how that process happens on Isle of Palms. The water that's coming out of the tidal inlet that we saw here, so it's coming straight out. Eventually, the energy of the wave, remember the wave is just as important as the tide here, is going to be pushing that channel down to the south. And as it moves to the south, eventually, it's going to move through the ebb delta, and it's going to become almost parallel with the beach next to it. So the tidal channel is going to run parallel to shore. This happens at Sullivan's at Breach Inlet a lot as well. And then eventually, the hydrodynamics just don't work anymore with that bend, and it shoots back out and straightens again. And when that straightening process happens, all the sand that was on the right side of the delta now just gently comes on shore. And you can walk out to Sullivan's Island any day, low tide, and actually see this happening. It's pretty cool. Here's a photo that was taken back in the 1980s of one of these sandbars attaching or welding to the beach face, and the same process happens every few years, which is why our barrier islands look like this, with all these beach ridges that have grown out over time. All right. So that is the end of the beaches and waves conversation. So tides and barrier islands, beaches and waves. Now, just one slide on dunes and wind, because dunes are also really important here. What do dunes need to form? So the little picture on the bottom left shows you that you need sand, right? You need reliable winds, and you need to be inundated infrequently, so not in an area of chronic erosion. You also need a barrier to slow the wind, a little piece of sand or a sand fence, right? So that eventually that sand will start blowing, the wind will blow into it, the sand will fall out, and it will start to grow. And you've probably seen this happen on the beach too. Over time, we call those coppice mounds that grow out in front of the main primary dune. Over time, they will grow and eventually become the new primary dune. So that's the process that we saw in the picture before. As the sandbar moves on shore, then a little dune starts to form, and you get the dune ridges that grow and build out that part of the barrier island. Dunes go through the same process that beaches do, with a fair weather situation and a storm situation, but then they recover. So dunes can keep up with a small amount of seasonal variation without really being eroded. And dunes also just really can't survive in an area of chronic erosion, so they need that fair weather recovery time to come back. Okay, last slide for the science part of the conversation. Now that we've learned about all these processes, we have a very, very important question: what is beach erosion? And the answer is actually really simple. It's just that you have less sand coming into your island as you have going out. Beach erosion is a simple mass balance. So these are sediment budgets. They can be fairly complicated, but really it's just sand in is less than sand out. And as you saw from the examples, there aren't a lot of times on a natural beach where you really have bad erosion problems, right? The fair weather profile, the storm profile, it will come back, it will recover. It's not until the evil humans get involved that we start to have erosion problems. So the second part of today's class is going to be talking about what causes erosion. So here we're going to talk about human modifications to beaches and inlets. We're a third of the way through. All right, there are two main human modifications to beaches and inlets, and this isn't just for Folly, although it's very obvious here, but this has happened again all over the country. One of the things that we like to remind members of our organizations is that you are dealing with some problems here on your beach that seem really acute and unique, but actually they're happening all over the country, and that's reassuring because you can get lessons learned from other communities. So jetties have been built all over the country and have caused major problems for the downdrift beaches. The Army Corps, the federal government, has come in and tried to address that when they built the jetties by a law called Section 111 that allows communities to be compensated for the damages caused by those jetties. So we'll talk about that. And then the second human modification was just unregulated beachfront development prior to the 1970s when the Coastal Zone Management Act was passed. People, as we saw in Miami Beach, right? People were just bulldozing dunes, building wherever they wanted on the beachfront. That doesn't happen today, but we are left with those mistakes of our forefathers, and now we have to figure out how to manage them. The way that we've dealt with unregulated beachfront development is our states have created jurisdictional lines or construction lines, and communities as well to help with that, as you know. So these are the two major human modifications that I want to talk to you about, and as I said, these are sort of mistakes by our forefathers that have been handed down to us, and now we have to figure out how to manage them. So the first one will...
Before you go on with that, what would have been the alternate from building the jetties? Because we needed the clear access to our harbors.
Absolutely.
So is there an alternative?
No.
So,
We have to live with them.
so even today, if that was an issue, jetties would have been the answer?
Absolutely. Yeah, and here's why. So jetties have a very important purpose, and they do their job extremely well. They're navigational structures. They're shore perpendicular, as you know. There's normally two of them. And their job is to reduce sand coming into that channel, so maintain passage, and to provide a little wave sheltering. You can see the wave energy on one side of this picture here versus the other. However, they result in some pretty significant changes to the adjacent beaches, and specifically negative impacts to the downdrift beach. So they're also a really good indicator of longshore sediment transport direction. Think Sullivan's Island with lots of beach, Folly and Morris with no beach. Like, obviously the sand is going this way, right?
You're just talking about the big ones.
The big
Or you're talking
ones.
about the small ones too?
The small ones aren't jetties. We'll get to those.
Okay.
So jetties are specifically for navigation. Jetties are built at harbors, at inlets. And as I mentioned, they do their job very well. So the schematic on the right shows you what we kind of have alluded to already. Sand is in a mass balance situation. You can't create sand, right? There is as much as it is along the coast, so if you have sand trapped on the updrift side of a jetty, you'll have an equal amount of erosion on the downdrift side. This is a picture from Port Canaveral. Those jetties, like ours, were built 50 to 100 years ago. Those were built in 1948, and they had kind of that classic downdrift erosion signature there as well. When I teach the extended version of this course, I go into these fun stories about different communities around the country that have similarly suffered from X example. So I'm not going to tell the stories, but I will just show you the slides. So Ocean City, Maryland is in a very similar situation to Folly, where the jetties were built. Over time, the downdrift beach, which is Assateague Island, actually doubled back on itself in the process of, as a result of jetty construction. So look up Assateague Island in Ocean City, Maryland if you want another example, but today we'll talk about our example. So the main channel of Charleston Harbor, the ship channel, you can see it, it pretty much paralleled Morris Island. Remember we talked about these mixed energy inlets that kind of migrate around, and at the time that this map was created, it was down, the channel was down parallel to Morris Island. Eventually it would break back through and the sand would all get transported to the south. Well, in the Civil War era, that resulted in a lot of shipwrecks, and this was a major problem. So navigation was the main priority. The barrier islands weren't developed. Nobody cared about Morris Island or Folly Beach at the time. So the jetties were constructed by the Army Corps in the late 1800s. These aren't just any jetties. You saw the pictures of Assateague. They're nothing compared to these. These are 3 miles long. 3 miles extending out into the ocean. So not only are we having effects to the immediate downdrift beach, we have regional effects. Both Morris Island and Folly Beach are affected by these 3 mile long jetties. We're in the sand shadow of the jetties. So as a result of the construction of these jetties, Morris and Folly get cut off from that longshore sediment transport that's moving along their coast. What happens, the erosion rate on Morris Island quintuples. It increases to about 50 feet per year. The island doubles back on itself and leaves us where we are today with that lighthouse kind of stranded out to sea. So when you see things like the lighthouse or maybe a seawall, you're walking along the beach, you're like, what in the world, why is that there? And you have to think back to kind of what the scenario looked like. A lighthouse isn't built in the middle of the ocean, right? It's built safely on the backside of a barrier island, which is where this one was built. The island has eroded.
I have a question. So the end of Morris Island isn't there anymore, so does that not create further problems with water and stuff coming
Yeah,
out?
there's actually a gap in the jetties in this area, so that unlike on Sullivan's now, the jetty connects to land. There's actually a hole in the jetty there where it used to connect to Morris Island. And
So does a ton of sand go in?
there is some transport, and the Corps has done a couple of studies to kind of figure out how to better manage that area. But essentially, all of the sand that would have been coming down the Folly Beach naturally, and there wasn't that much of it anyway, because at the same time that the jetties were built, the Santee River was dammed, so a lot of the sand that was coming down from the mountains naturally through the rivers wasn't getting here anymore. So we kind of had a double whammy there, and now we have severe erosion on both Folly and Morris Island. Okay, so as I mentioned, the federal government has tried to help with these types of problems caused by jetties. They've recognized that their federal engineering works have negatively impacted downdrift communities, and hence the Section 111 law, which allows for a beach nourishment project to be built by the federal government at an increased cost share to the federal government. So they're going to pay us for the damages they've caused us. Normally, a Army Corps beach project is cost shared 65% federal and 35% non-federal. So the state or the local community pays 35% of the cost. In this case, the 65% goes up by the amount of damages caused by the jetties. It was a complicated math problem that took 10 years to figure out, but we landed on 85% should be paid by the federal government, 15% by the locals. This was great news. There was much rejoicing when the federal project was finally achieved. I brought Richard Beck's book. He details this process very nicely. It's great that we have someone who was around at the time that documented that for us. I highly recommend checking that out for the lengthy story. But the community essentially now has a golden ticket. The Army Corps of Engineers is going to come in and put sand on our beach, so we're good to go, right? We don't have to worry about beach erosion anymore. We're set.
Go ahead, say it, accept.
But,
Yeah.
and I must say, we're doing great for a long time. The outcome was remarkable. So you may have seen this picture from 1982 of this guy standing at the tide seawall with 20 feet of seawall above him. So just imagine how much sand was lost there and how much has been put back since the project. The Mayor Goodwin talks about playing, what does he call it, half ball against that wall there? Like as a little racquetball area. Same thing if you're standing on the pier looking east in 1986, we have no beach. The storms are knocking down houses. Now if you look at that same location, the federal project has greatly enhanced our beach. Similar situation to the project I described at Miami Beach, right? We were not in a good economic condition, and now look what we have. However, there are some drawbacks to federal projects. One of them is kind of that psychological thing that I just alluded to, like, oh, we're fine. We don't have to worry about any other things because the beach will always be there, right? So that happened. Nourishment is largely, the timing of nourishment is largely outside of our hands. The federal government and the Army Corps are kind of deciding. Of course, we're partners much better than we were in the past now, and we work together with them on that, but we don't decide, okay, we need a project next year, let's make it happen. It's not that easy. And then also, anything that happens within our federal project area has to go through a pretty rigorous review. Like if we want to improve the pier, if we want to build new groins, we can't just go do that. We have to go through a process called the 408 review with the Army Corps of Engineers. So
Is
it
that a
has
good
its
thing?
pluses and minuses.
Is that a good thing? Does their input on those reviews give us a good result? Well, can't answer that.
Nicole, it does enhance the probability or likelihood of matching funds going in from the
Yeah,
federal.
it creates a nice collaboration. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a benefit.
Yes.
It tells the feds that we're trying to play ball with them,
Yes.
that they budget what is.
And I would say the other benefit is that it shows that we're not in the same complacent mode that we were 2 decades ago. We're just saying, sure, help fix it, parachute in and make us better. We're actually saying we're a partner and we want to do things that improve the beach
Well,
as well.
that's a real positive.
Absolutely.
Richard Beck said the motto of the Army Corps of Engineers is overhead is our most important product.
So, when we, go ahead.
Well, this isn't necessarily about that, but what about a named storm? Because I know often they'll help when
Well,
there's
that's
a
what I'm
name.
gonna ask.
Okay.
Like
there's a
when we
named
have an
storm.
emergency thing,
Yeah.
like with Hurricane Matthew.
Great point. So that's another massive benefit, the golden ticket that I mentioned. Not only are we building projects at a significantly reduced cost share, but if a named storm, if a federal disaster is declared in South Carolina and we lose a significant amount of sand, the Army Corps will replace or will redo our entire beach at 100% federal. And that has actually happened for our last 2 renourishments. We haven't paid for a renourishment project here in about a decade because of that
With
benefit.
the-
That's probably the biggest benefit of
With the
federal project.
emergency renourishments, how long does that normally take to get through the?
About 2 years.
Yeah.
So again, that's the disadvantage. We can't be like, okay, the
Just
storm's
cost them
gone, let's
more
get
to
a
wait
dredge,
that
let's
long.
get the sand out there. Right.
What's the
That makes
danger of just
sense.
getting defunded? What's I mean,
Yes,
how do
I
you
would
know
say
that
highly
moves?
unlikely. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about the federal project and how it was recently renewed for another 50 years.
Oh,
Yeah, so we're in really good shape there, pending congressional ads and funding in Washington, but I'm in Washington, I'll be there Monday, so you're in good hands.
One more
Better you
question.
than me.
One more question. When you say we're paying for it, is we, the city of Folly Beach, or Charleston County, or where's that money
The
come
city
from?
of Folly Beach, so we have our beach preservation fee, and so that, there's a special fund that the city has set aside specifically dedicated to saving up money for beach nourishment. Okay, so let's talk about, I love your enthusiasm, thank you for being so engaged. The second major human modification to the beachfront, as I said, was sort of unregulated coastal development. So this is an example from the west coast of Florida, but again, similar examples all over where a drumstick barrier island, you can see it in like 1873, was developed. Florida beaches were developed sooner than ours. They started around 1920s. This middle image is from 1926. And you can see maybe the ebb tidal delta out there in front of that inlet. in the condition of the beach kind of today, modern era, it resembles nothing of what it looked like in the past, and notice the tidal delta is gone. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna zoom in on that area where it says Upham Beach and talk a little bit about what happened here. So that tidal delta you saw in the 20s collapsed, and it moved on shore because of major stabilization efforts along the coastline. So you see the seawall that is built on the 1967 image, terribly ill-sited development with this condominium complex built literally on top of the dunes, and the pool is at the shoreline here. When the tidal delta collapses like that, it gives the property owners and the community a false sense of security. Look how wide that beach was in 51. Sure, go ahead, build a condo out there, right? Well, once that delta was gone, it didn't come back. The whole system was destabilized. So now, because of human interventions, we don't have the luxury that we had in the science portion of the talk, where things recover. So that resulted in the construction you see ongoing in '67, and then what this place looked like in the early 2000s. It's one of the most armored tidal inlets in the country. This is where I actually did my dissertation at studying this beach. And so it's a classic beach erosion problem, which really is just the result of ill-advised development and armoring of the entire shoreline, holding the line, essentially. Okay. So the solution, we talked about the states now coming in and establishing these setback lines, construction lines. So the setback line here in Florida is called the coastal construction line. It's that red line. And you can see where it was drawn is pretty much like out in front of most of the development, except that one condo that should have never been built there. So nothing in Florida now can get built on the front side of that line. We have a similar process here in South Carolina. They're called state jurisdictional lines. And we have a setback line and a baseline along most of our coastlines. So the red line is the baseline. The blue line is the setback line, and our lines are established on 40-year erosion rates, and they're updated every 7 years based on what has happened over the last decade or so. So unlike the Florida line, that's static, the lines in South Carolina are updated and they move. The red line is the baseline. Anything that happens in front of that line requires pretty serious permitting and consultation with the state in order to do anything out there.
So all that was there before the baseline was
Correct.
set.
So if, say, something happens and everything up in front of the red baseline gets destroyed, it can't be built back.
Can't be built back, even if it's damaged more than 50%.
And does that change as that'll change then I guess as the baseline and setback lines are
Yes,
adjusted?
that's the lines. And every 7 years, you hear a new round of lawsuits coming forward, saying, oh no, you can't move my baseline there, it should be here. And
Where are we right now in the
we are about to, we have entered into another renewal phase, and they're working their way up the coast, so they're in like the Hilton Head area now. Next year they'll be up here.
Okay.
Right. However, we don't have to worry about this on Folly Beach because we have a special exemption.
But you can build in front of that if you get permission from the state.
Yes,
Because we have some that were.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So because of the erosion of the Charleston Harbor jetties, or caused by them, the state also jumped on board to kind of what the federal government did, and they said, you know what, we're not even gonna make a 40-year setback line on Folly, we're just gonna create a baseline, and it's never gonna be. So very similar to what we saw in Florida, okay? The baseline was set in 1992, and same thing though, if, not the same thing. If the seawalls or bulkheads are damaged more than 50% here, they can be rebuilt. So that's another very
can
important
be.
distinction.
Yes.
They can, yes.
Can.
All right.
Seals.
So I just want to kind of go back to that psychological thing. So the Corps gave it to us, right? They were like, oh, you'll be fine. We're going to give you a stand. And then the state gave it to us. So we're thinking, we have won here. Like, we are exempt from everything. We really shouldn't have to do other things, right, on Folly Beach. Like, we're set. We're going to be fine. But things are interesting. So this is our baseline. This is how it was set, like the Florida example, pretty much right in front of the development, right, the red line there. And you can see some weird things that are happening that Paula alluded to there with some pocket lots. But here's what it looked like on the east end. And the line was drawn out in front of platted lots, right? This part of Folly hadn't been developed yet. So this is what it looked like when the line was drawn. This is 1992. Guess why the beach looked like this?
Development.
We were in a period of that ebb tidal delta moving on shore. So we learned about the Drumstick Barrier Islands and the sand coming on shore. So we're very sand rich when the line is drawn. Much like that example in Florida where the ebb tidal delta collapses and comes on shore, and they feel confident to build that condo out there. It resulted in a false sense of security, and the line was drawn out in front of platted lots. Okay, unfortunately.
On that picture, go back if you would. Where's the gate to the, at the end of the?
It's off the picture. This line here is Summer Place Lane.
I don't know.
That's the last street on,
Seventeen hundred.
that's the last street, and then this is the last home. So the gate is kind of up here.
Okay, so the last home that's still the last home
Uh,
on the.
no, there's now two more, I believe, since 1992 there to the right.
So that's the end of the road essentially?
Correct.
Ah, so that's why those houses got built.
Yes, so the line is out there on the beachfront, and then some of the lots get developed, right? Hence our super beachfront houses. So, this again, sure, we are exempt from state law. Yes, there is a baseline out there, but was this the right thing for Folly to allow to happen? No, right? And there, trust me, again, kind of like the story about the Army Corps of Engineers, and the 10-year-long lawsuit, similar, like Folly didn't want this to happen. Ben can tell you all about it, but it did, right?
Did Tom have any choice but to grant those
No,
permits?
we stalled those guys, telling them, no, you can't build for about 6 or 7 years. Several of them sued us. We went to every agency on the planet, and they all said, you're absolutely right, you can't let them build there, but we don't have any way to help you.
Right.
So you either bought the land or you let them build.
And so, we let some of them get built, but eventually now we're starting to see, like, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't just rely on the Corps and the state line to keep us safe, maybe we need to do some stuff too. So, the one other thing that happens as a result of that line being set out there is this. So the Army Corps of Engineers line, construction line, also gets set at the baseline, which means it's public land on this side of the line, but it's private property up there. The Army Corps is not putting sand on private property. So we end up with this situation where even the lots that weren't developed, that are beach, aren't getting renourished. So we had a few renourishment cycles dealing with this no nourishment behind the line. And it was another challenge that presented itself in 2014. So I'm gonna wrap up this section now on human modifications, and I don't wanna be too overly dramatic here, but the construction of the jetties and the exemption from the state baseline changed the course of history for Folly Beach. And again, these were coastal management decisions that were out of our hands, but we have since not just thrown our hands up in the air and said, there's nothing we can do. We have taken action, and we're managing this with good and informed policy now. So what has happened is that in 2010, we basically had no rules about coastal development. We thought the core project and the state lines were gonna save us. We had no setbacks on the beachfront, we had no setbacks on the marsh front. But in 2010, again, this is like when I'm teaching this first course here, right now it's 2013, and I'm like, come on guys. But fortunately, Aaron Pope is here, Eric Lutz is here, the Mayor Goodwin, and they are starting to make really great decisions. Ben is here. They rewrite the ordinance, the zoning ordinance, and then in 2025, they start to even say things like sea level rise and begin to address climate change. And that was really the turn that happened on Folly. Also in 2015 was this little storm called Joaquin. It's called the 1,000-year flood up in Colombia. So the state got smart to it, and then we were hit by hurricanes for about 4 years in a row, triggering some of that emergency renourishment and we didn't let any emergency go to waste. We really got a lot done in that time period.
Question, so
Yep.
unlike Owl Ponds, Folly, that red line is in front of all the Folly houses.
It is.
That has not been moved.
That's right. There are one or two exceptions, but overall, the baseline is seaward of all of our development.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't understand the difference between the critical baseline and setback line.
Well, we don't have a setback line.
Oh, That's fine, that's all I need to know.
There's a setback line from the baseline.
Critical baseline is setback line.
So, well, let me say this, the setback line is a state line, and you can see it here on Wild Dunes. And it is, the baseline is supposed, well, it is, it's in front of that line. If something gets damaged more than 50%, you're not gonna build it back. So ideally, they want all the beaches to look like Folly with sand on front of the baseline and houses behind it, right? That's the goal here. The setback line is a less stringent type of regulatory line that demarks the 40-year erosion rate. So 40 years from now, they're saying, without anything changing, the baseline will be where the setback line is today, okay? We don't have one on Folly, but what has also happened, that I don't have in that slide, is we've created a dune management area. And there's a line on Folly now that is 40 feet back from the baseline that functions very similarly to the state setback line. So it's almost like, well, thanks guys, but you probably should have given us a setback line in the first place, because you don't want a whole lot happening. You don't want construction between those two lines. You know, maybe a pool you could let happen, but you really want to ideally push your construction even behind the setback line.
Does the dune management line, does that ever change, or is that?
It's fixed like the
It's
baseline.
fixed, it is
Yes.
fixed.
So you mentioned that the state was looking at Hilton Head, then coming here. What would they do here since our
They won't do
baseline's
anything
fixed?
here. However, we are in the process of our new local comprehensive beachfront management plan, which is the plan that's mandated by the state, and that is the first order of business, is to talk to them, especially about the pocket lots and the Folly Beach Nature Conservancy lots. Like, we think there should be some shifts in that baseline, so that should be a really huge thing for Folly, so we'll see how that goes.
Is this similar on the marsh side? Is there a line on the marsh side?
There is, so it's not as complicated back there. It's simply a jurisdictional line, but it's called a critical line. And it is mapped by elevation, and so you need a state permit to do anything on the marsh side of it, and upland of that is your private property.
Nicole, you got a lot of planning commission members in here.
Yeah, I love it.
And we have remanded from council to the planning commission, in your plans that we have to do for the upgrades and the 10-year plan and all that stuff. So they're working diligently right now with things that the council has said. You guys gotta come up with something to us so that we have an opportunity then to budget and fund and make sure. The preservation funds that that the city has been diligent in saving, we are hanging on to that like a dog on a bone. And there are outside interests that want us to pull money from that all the time to do things. While they're nice to have, as was alluded to earlier, one good hurricane, and if we have to stop operating because we've lost infrastructure out here, we need that money for that emergency operations for water and sewer and the things that will be ceased to happen. So if you think the city, we're in good financial shape right now, but we're asking the planning commission to be very aggressive in their look at the comprehensive plan, beach renourishment plans, and those things, so that we have that additional input at the council. Didn't mean to take it.
That's great, that's great.
This is probably out of the scope with all of the evolution of the beaches here on Folly. How is it that there are plats of land on the beach that belong to, that are privately owned?
Right, it's because the way the lots were platted back when there was plenty of beach, before the erosion got so severe, there was a road called Benke Road out there.
What was it called?
Benke, Benke, and that's documented in the book as well. So just because the beach erodes doesn't mean the plats go away, right? People still own those, and some, we saw one for sale, it's like underwater
Yeah,
lot,
that's
hey.
recent.
Well,
That's
they're paid-
recently, you could- that's
they
that-
pay taxes
yeah.
on that.
Right,
Yeah.
so the lots still exist, and that's part of the beach preservation plan, as well as property acquisition is an allowable use of those
Okay.
funds. So hey, if a $10,000 lot comes up, let's buy it, let's get that land into the public trust.
Didn't a private citizen buy it on
I'm not
the
sure about
washout?
some of that one.
I don't know. So going back to the state coming here while they're moving up the coast, are they doing, like, providing results of their research? Are they doing anything, or they just skip over
Yeah.
Folly completely?
No, they do the analysis for Folly, so,
Okay.
we'll be engaged, and, yeah, we'll
Okay.
come to the planning commission with some of that stuff, and invite them,
Yeah.
the DES to come in now at this point. DES and BCM, the acronym's changed. Okay, we have, the third of our course to get through now, so I think we'll get through part of this, maybe and we'll see if we need to take a break or not. And then I'd like to take you out to the beach and show you some of this stuff in real life. So, the third part of the class here is to talk about, right now we know about beach processes, we know what's causing erosion, now how do we address it? How do we preserve our beach? All right, the beach preservation exists in a spectrum. From your one option is to do nothing on one side, I call that the left. The other side on the right is to hold the line. So you're doing whatever, at all costs, you are not moving back. And along this spectrum, we're gonna talk about several different tools that you can use to achieve those goals. We're gonna talk about structures first. Structures got a really bad reputation in the 60s and 70s. Our groins out here were built in the 40s and 50s by DOT to protect our road from erosion. But they got a bad reputation because essentially they were mostly applied at the individual property. So, Mr. Smith's beach is eroding. He says, well, I'm gonna build a little groin because I know the longshore sediment transport will get trapped by it and I'll get a beach. But what happens to Mr. Davis next to him? What happens to his beach? It goes away. The amount of beach this guy gains, the amount of beach that guy loses, right? So that process went on unregulated, just like beachfront development, until the 1970s, again, when the Coastal Zone Management Act was passed and the states got some regulation there. Structures were thought of as more of a long-term solution, and they aren't if there's no sand. Okay, so we'll talk about that. With each of these different types of structure, or different types of beach preservation tools, we're gonna focus on a different part of our cross-section that we discussed earlier, and we're gonna start out with armoring, so you can see where the green box is there in the location of the seawall, kind of at the base of the dune. Okay, so armoring structures, these are essentially seawalls. They're these shore parallel structures built upland to protect from wave energy and limit landward erosion. Their goal is to hold the line, okay? There are three types of armoring structures: seawalls, revetments, and bulkheads. Seawalls are tall vertical walls. They have deep foundations, and they're meant to withstand high wave energy. A revetment is a sloped surface on the back beach. Think of the revetment at the washout. Revetments are commonly built along coastal roadways because they absorb wave energy, and you don't have a lot of interest in maintaining any type of beach. All you really care about is protecting the slope to protect what's behind it. And then bulkheads we see a lot here on our marsh front. These are lower energy barrier walls that typically don't have the fortifications of a seawall. Okay. This is the story time slide, and I'm going to skip over. So Galveston, Texas is one of the most amazing stories of creating a seawall after a devastating hurricane in the early 1900s. They raised up their entire town and built this massive seawall that still exists today, a coastal engineering marvel. And I will, so look up Galveston if you want to learn that story. It's fascinating. But you notice that their seawall is sloped, and the reason that they did that was to try to reduce scour. So we talked about our fair weather and storm profile, right? If there's a wall in the middle of it, things are gonna happen differently. Okay, you can't, there's no sand to erode during the winter time and carry out into the sandbar. So what happens is it takes the sand, it scours it from underneath the base of the seawall at the toe. And once that sand is lost, it typically doesn't come back, like with the fair weather and storm profiles that we saw. So that is what happens in front of seawalls. It results in scour. On Folly, we actually require that our seawalls are fronted by a revetment, so it helps to reduce that scour. All right, this is a great example of that exact, what I just described. And I have a question for you. Is this seawall working? Is it doing its purpose?
Protecting the land behind it.
And
Yes.
the answer is yes. That armoring structure is doing a great job. However, it is not doing anything for the beach in this situation, right? It's also sticking out almost like a groin, so that longshore sediment transport is being affected as well. So it's causing a lot of problems, but it is doing its job. It's an effective seawall.
Where is that?
That is this Summer Place Lane. It looks nothing like that today. has a big dune in front of it.
Is that the issue with the house on Sullivan's, guy that's suing and going back and forth, throw a
Olive
seal.
Palms.
That's Olive Palms, yeah, it is, we probably shouldn't get into that today, but it's a very complicated answer there. But he has built an illegal seawall. And this is why it's illegal. So, while you can build seawalls on Folly, because we are exempt from this, the state of South Carolina has passed a law that no new seawalls are allowed because of the negative effects on adjacent properties. That doesn't apply here. This is the most effective type of seawall, a buried seawall. It's an ideal situation. This is actually something that engineers are trying to replicate nowadays, but we're fortunate here in Folly that this exists along almost our entire island. We call it redundant coastal engineering, or a hybrid structure where your seawall is buried. You have a wide beach in front of it and a dune on top of it, and the seawall only becomes exposed under the most dire circumstances, major damage, and it's there to protect the upland property. You know, the beach is eroded, dune is gone, the seawall is still there as a backstop.
We have that on file?
Every
Very
single
see-
beachfront house has this. Because this, remember the picture I showed looking from the pier with the waves attacking? Every property on Folly had built a seawall at that time. So under all the dunes are seawalls. In fact, we'll see it today when you walk out over a lot of the accesses, you can see the ripraps from those old seawalls out there. Okay, question here. Do buried seawalls cause erosion?
No.
Not at all. They're the ideal situation. They're not interacting with the waves and currents and longshore transport, so they're just there as kind of insurance. Okay, this is where I was thinking I would ask you if you needed a break, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna keep going. If you need a break, feel free to step out. So now we're gonna move on to talking about longshore sediment transport structures. So we'll move down the profile and talk about groins and breakwaters. Notice that these are down in that area of the beach we talked about where there's a lot of energy happening, waves are breaking, and sand is moving around. All right, so as we saw with the seawalls, if the structure is not interacting with waves and currents like the buried seawall, it has no effect on the beaches, but once it starts jutting out there into the longshore transport, it will have an effect. And these are some indicators of longshore sediment transport direction. So if you walk out to the beach, you see a groin, you say, oh wow, the sand is piled up on the left side and there's no sand on this side, that means the transport is going in that direction.
What does LST stand for?
Longshore sediment transport. And just a reminder, structures don't create sand, they redistribute sand. Okay, so the amount that's trapped on one side will be the amount of erosion that happens on the other side. Okay, so with that, these two types of structures I want to talk to you about are groins. You see what it says at the bottom there? This answers your question from before. These are not jetties. A lot of people call them jetties. They look very similar, but their purpose is very different. Their purpose is related to preserving a beach. It's to impound sand on one side to widen the beach, okay? To slow down that longshore sediment transport. As we've already discussed, we have an equal amount of downdrift erosion, and there are many different types of groins that we may or may not get into. So the classic example here is the village of West Hampton Dunes in New York. Again, long story, but essentially a dune field is built in the middle of a barrier island without beach nourishment. And what happens is all the longshore sediment transport gets trapped by the groins, and the village downdrift of it, which is now its own incorporated community because of all this, is destroyed entirely. There's a breach in 1992, and we learned a lot of lessons from what happened here at West Hampton Dunes. In fact, so much so that the National Academies of Science published engineering guidance on how to construct and install groins, and they say each fixed structure used in conjunction with the beach nourishment project should be filled to the upper limit of its holding capacity if its function is to retain sand. Okay, this has been incorporated into all Army Corps practices, all private consulting engineering practices, and what it means is if you're gonna build groins, you have to re-nourish too. You can't just stick groins out there because it'll trap all the sand and it won't get, starve the downdrift beach. So we call this pre-mitigation or pre-filling the structures with sand.
So, question, so, for example, on the west side, the groins are gone, they're under the sand. Those aren't rebuilt, they're just.
Yes. So for that, we are able to rebuild groins on Folly and actually in all of South Carolina. So Folly Beach, where's that slide? It's coming up here. We have 50 groins, 50 along Folly Beach. As I said, many of them were built in the 40s and 50s by the DOT. DOT to protect the roadways, and they were timber pile groins, as you've seen. They're deteriorated to an extent that they're not doing much at this point. We are in the process of rehabilitating the groins on Folly Beach, and we'll talk about that project, hopefully go out and see it later. And that groin field that you're referring to is in the cycle for rehabilitation. And that leads us to the way that South Carolina regulates groins. Not illegal like seawalls, you can build groins, they prefer you to rehabilitate them, and new groins are a little bit harder to get approved, even on Folly. Okay, the last type of groin I want to talk to you about today is a really important one, and it's a terminal groin. So the difference here is terminal groins are a little bit more like jetties in their location. They are at the end of a barrier island, kind of at the inlet, but their purpose isn't to provide safe navigation. They have nothing to do with navigation. They have everything to do with preserving the beach. So the terminal groin is, once it fills up, it doesn't have downdrift impacts because there's a big hole on the other side of it. It's just an inlet over there. So it's one of our more effective structures that we can install. So here's a picture of one in Florida. This one is from Paso Grill Channel. It was built in 1959, and here's why. In 1936, you can see the beach is nice and wide, but because of some poor management decisions and beach erosion, this is actually at the other end of that island we looked at earlier with all the armoring at the north end at Upham Beach. This is the south end, and by 1959, the beach is gone. So by constructing that terminal groin, the beach has infilled and very little maintenance is required in this area because of the sediment trapping that happens at that location.
So if we had a groin at the end of the island that's 300 feet out, we would need to re-nourish our beach?
And we do. So this slide was created before the terminal groin was built. And the question that I asked the class is, Folly Beach at that time has 49 groins along the entire island, but we don't have the one groin that actually makes sense. So where would be the smartest place to put a structure on this island? At the end, right? We didn't have one at the time. And the Folly Beach County Park ended up looking like this, right? And so hopefully we'll have some time to go out there and take a look at the drastic change that has happened as a result of the construction of that
The concrete one
terminal.
that's out there, isn't it down there? Is there a concrete one?
There is a sheet pile and rock terminal groin at the end of the county park. It's 745 feet long.
But it's not big enough?
Folly Beach County Park. No, it's lovely, it's perfect.
Oh,
It's
okay.
doing great. All right, I just want to briefly talk to you about breakwaters for a second. They don't work in South Carolina, so we won't spend a lot of time on them, but I do want to tell you why. So the purpose of breakwaters, they either reduce energy kind of to make a safe harbor, or they can limit erosion at a beachfront. If they're intended on a beach, they need to be built seaward of the breaker line to reduce the wave energy that's coming to the beach. And they also have lots of different forms. This is one that was built at a harbor in California that's, as you can see, creating a safe harbor for that area. Here's why breakwaters don't work in South Carolina. So you can see the first bullet there. It says if the breakwater crest is near still water level, it's only going to reduce your wave energy by 20%. So even if your breakwater is pretty much sticking out of the water, it's right at the surface, it's not going to dampen the wave energy that much, 20%. And then the shallower it gets, the less effect it has on wave energy, okay?
Is that what they have down in Hilton Head where they have marinas inside? They do breakwaters and the marinas are, because their shoreline isn't straight.
Yeah, probably, I don't know exactly what you're talking to, but they're very common at marinas, yep. So if we were to use them for beach erosion, they would need to be pretty far offshore, and our tidal range comes into play here. So the breakwater itself would only be interacting with the wave energy and at that sweet spot for a very short amount of time because of how much water is moving in and out, kind of like the example of the river. So not only is it only reducing wave energy by 10 or 20%, it's only doing it for 10 or 20% of the time. So they're pretty much not effective whatsoever
It
in
needs to
South
float,
Carolina.
right, like in Italy. Those walls float to dampen the wave energy up with
Float.
Venice, right?
Sure, yeah, that's used. They have very low wave energy there, and currents aren't as much of a challenge. So that is it.
Oh, right.
Okay, and breakwaters aren't even mentioned in the South Carolina law, just because it's not So to conclude the part here about structures, I have my pun that it's a hard decision if you want to install hard structures. Hardening the coastline is the most intrusive method of shore protection, so we're way over on that hold the line end of the spectrum. If you are going to install structures, it's recommended that you advance fill with beach nourishment around your structures. They're most effective at the end of your island, right, so that there's nothing to impact on the downdrift side. And they redistribute sand, they do not create sand. Okay, so this is the spectrum I was trying to help you visualize earlier. We've talked about holding the line with armoring structures and longshore sediment transport structures. So now let's talk a little bit about this center portion here, so soft shore protection. Nowadays, people like to call these nature-based solutions, but we've been doing beach nourishment since the 60s, and sure, it was nature-based solution then. We're solving the problem of erosion by adding more sand. We're addressing the very problem that has been created. So we'll talk about beach nourishment and dunes. Okay. Have you all seen a beach nourishment project on Folly? Okay, great. So we don't have to go into too much detail. This is what they look like. I have another course called Dredging 101. I'd love to get that to you sometime. In fact, Ella Palms has a nourishment project coming up, and I would love to take y'all out on their dredge when it's here so you can see a beach nourishment project in process. So let's plan to do that. This is what the nourished beaches look like most of the time when the dredges aren't there. They look just like natural beaches. You'd never know that they're nourished, and that's the whole point of renourishment, is to approximate the natural system. So with beach nourishment, you may hear it called lots of different things: replenishment, restoration, renourishment, preservation, but we're talking about the placement of sand along an eroding beach to advance the shoreline seaward. We need a borrow area, that's where we get our sand, and we need to think about the sediment, and if that sediment in the borrow area is gonna work on our beach, and that's what we call sediment compatibility. In Florida, they have a very complicated law. In South Carolina, ours is just like, hey, it should be close to the native. That's about all they say, but the law here is an interesting one. It talks about the composition, the size, the color, all these things that we do think about in South Carolina. It's just not codified. In Florida, they call it the sand rule. As we talked about, the coarser the sand, the steeper your profile. So like in the Outer Banks, right, steep beaches. So if we were to put coarse sand on Folly Beach, sure, it would pile up and it would stay there, but it's not compatible with native. It's not gonna work for sea turtles. It's not gonna work for maintaining the beach that we have. So you want to approximate the native sand in both color and size when you're restoring a beach.
But back in 14, 15, whenever we were doing it, it looked like the rocks were so big that came in on the renourishment, it looked like landmines all over the beach.
I have a picture of that here at some point.
That was what, because we went offshore to the ocean side and we didn't take it out of the river.
Exactly, and so the sediment was not very compatible. And as I think, I don't know if you know the turtle rule. So why the sand needs to be the color is that the temperature of the sand governs the sex of the sea turtles. So a lot of sea turtle nesting here in the southeast, and if you get different colored sand, our sand's pretty dark here, so we have kind of hot nests. If the sand is white, then this nest will be much cooler, and that could actually affect the sex of the entire sea turtle population. So it's really important to have the right color. You can remember this if you have your notes. You want to write this one down: cool dudes and hot chicks. So the cooler the sand, the sex of the reptile will be male, the hotter it will be female. All right, just some terminology when we talk about, we've already looked at our cross-section of our beach. When we think about beach nourishment, the cross-section of a profile response is really important. I'll show you the picture, which is better than the words. So remember we said most of the beach is underwater. It's like an iceberg. Okay, well, when the bulldozers are out there, they aren't going underwater, right? They can only operate up on the dry beach. So when we build a beach, we build it really wide, okay? And this is where a lot of the criticism of nourishment comes from. Oh, we spent all that money and it washed away. Well, I'm not doing my job in educating everyone to let them know that we meant that to happen, okay? So we have our design fill, which you see up there. That's how we want the beach to look all the time, whether we're renourishing or not. We have our advanced fill, which is the amount of erosion we expect to happen over the renourishment interval. Hey, we're gonna renourish again in 10 years. The beach erodes about 10 feet a year. We're gonna put 100 feet of advanced fill out there. That way, by the time we get back to design, it's time to renourish again. Then there's equilibration fill, okay? That's what we know is going straight into the ocean. we can't get down there and put the sand in that rest of like 2/3 of the beach profile that's underwater, so we expect the beach to, the wave energy to take that sand offshore. So that's what we call profile equilibration, and it's what happens in about the first 6 months after renourishment, and that's why the beach gets so narrow so fast. It's supposed to happen.
Is that, sand that gets pushed off a good source for nourishment? Because it's,
Oh, it doesn't go, it still stays within the beach profile, so you can see it's basically, it feeds the sandbar, it re-nourishes the part of the beach that's underwater. It doesn't go out offshore,
Okay.
it stays in the beach system. Yeah, good question. Okay, then the other thing is the way, so that's the way the beach re-nourishment acts this way across shore. It also spreads longshore, as we learned about with longshore transport. And this is gonna get pretty technical. Again, this is something I did my PhD on. I think this is a funny diagram. The way that we look at how, the way that we calculate how fast projects spread out. It's actually an error function, but basically your project is gonna spread out in both directions. And the thing I want you to note here is that the length of the project is the variable L, okay? And the longer your project, the more successful it will be, the slower it will spread out. So we can see here that the project, T50, that's how long it will last, that's the half-life of your project, is proportional to L. See, L is on top. So the longer your project, the longer your life, okay? And it's inversely proportional. See, H is on the bottom, H is wave height. The bigger the waves, the shorter your project will be,
when
okay?
you say project length, is that over time or
Yep.
physical space?
So physical space, so, if we were gonna build a project, let's say, all right, we have erosion around the pier, so we're just gonna re-nourish the pier, versus we're going to do this comprehensively, we're gonna nourish that entire island. So that's what I mean by length,
So length is physical distance
linear distance,
or
right?
square footage or something like that?
Correct.
So the bigger the area,
The bigger the
I
area,
gotcha.
the more successful the
Yeah.
project, yep. And so, if you have a project that's 1 mile long versus a project that's 4 mile long, kind of like what I was just describing there, it's incredible, in fact, how much more successful projects will be if they're full length. Not a big problem for us on Folly because we've always nourished pretty much the entire island. But I did want to ask you this question. So then if your nourishment project is performing poorly, and this is important for us, what are some options to improve the performance of your renourishment?
longer length.
You can make it longer. Well, I can't do that on Folly. We've maxed out. What else could you do? You could reduce the wave energy, right? H is on the bottom. You don't have a lot of control over that one, really. And the other thing you can do is you can increase the time. You just nourish more often. And so we can't do anything about, we can't get any longer with our project. We can't do much about the wave energy. So the only thing we can do is nourish more often. And that's, you know, people ask me, how do we improve performance? Well, if we're performing poorly, we need more sleep.
So go back to your formula, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 years, 32 years, but that's also a function of time. Right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, time, it is time. Time is the answer. Yep.
Ah,
Right. We'll talk more about it at the break. Then this is an example of a really long project, at the 10-mile long project in Nag's Head. We've been making comparisons with the Outer Banks, so I wanted to share this with you. It was renourished in 2014, 10 miles long, 2011, and in 2016, 90% of that sand remained out there. So really long projects. There's one in Panama City that's the longest project ever. Their performance is outstanding. So really that length factor really is important. Okay, let's briefly talk about the sand source. So this is your question about rocks and sediment compatibility. So we have to get our sand from somewhere. Sometimes sand comes from upland, like when we do small sand projects on private property, a lot of times the sand will be truck hauled in. But more often, the sand comes from offshore, from inlet shoals, from the river. And things that you need to think about when you're saying, oh, we're gonna get our sand from here, we have great sand there. How far away is it? what's the distance from the beach to the borrow area, because that's gonna drive up costs, you're gonna have to pump it farther, you're gonna need more fuel to do so. You want to look at all the other things like the size, the depth, the thickness of the sand, so there's, the point of this part of the presentation is to express to you how much work goes into finding the sand, and people don't even think about this, they just see the dredge show up pumping sand, but years and millions of dollars go into developing the sand source. So, the state has a really nice application, I can get you the website address, oh, there it is there, if you would like to check it out. And this shows all the renourishments that ever happened on Folly. You can see there were bunches of renourishments down at the county park before this happened. The Army Corps used to dredge Folly River with the little dredge they had out there a couple weeks ago, and they used to just throw the sand onto the county park. That funding got cut, and then this is the situation we got into. That funding got cut in 2006, and by 2013, we were in this situation because there was no sand hitting the county park. So that's all those renourishments you see there. Then our larger nourishments, as I mentioned, the full-scale projects are on here as well. And the offshore borrow areas are the areas in pink. So that's where we have taken sand from offshore, but more often we like to get it from the river. Talk about why that is.
What is our sand? It's all mountains. Is our sand all?
So I had a slide for that, but I took it out. Think of a granite countertop.
Mhm.
Our sand is coming from the mountains, coming down the rivers, and the white on the granite countertop is quartz. The black are your iron-rich minerals, and then the yellow, or the orange color, that's feldspar. So feldspar is pretty soft and it erodes away. The quartz and the iron-based minerals are what stay, and our sand is actually over 1 million years old, and that's how stable quartz is. So it came down from the Appalachian Mountains, and it's what's on our coastline today. Okay, again, we'll just go through this quickly. So if you're gonna look for sand offshore, you first do a side scan sonar survey. This is kind of like just a picture of the bottom. That way you can say, oh, there's a bunch of crap here, there's a shipwreck, there's a reef, right? I don't wanna go there. This is a barren sand patch, we'll head over there. Then you do a seismic survey, so now you're penetrating down and looking at the layers, and then ultimately you core the sand and you bring up actual samples. So this is your seismic, it's telling you, oh, okay, looks like mud here, looks like sand here, we're gonna take a core there and see what it is. And this is a vessel where the vibrocores are being brought up and they're cataloging the type of sand. Okay, so lots and lots of work. These are all the places offshore of Folly Beach that have been investigated. Those are all the vibrocore sites, and then you see the boxes of some potential borrow areas that do exist out there.
Who's doing that?
The Army Corps of Engineers is doing a lot of it, and BOEM, the other federal agency, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, works on that as well. Okay, so we can, again, we'll do a dredging 101 class if you'd like sometime and talk more about all of that. But I do want to just touch briefly on dredging because of the cost conversation that we've had. And this is another major win for the city that we want to talk about. So with, I said you want to worry about how far away your sand source is from your beach, right? If it's too far away, it's going to drive up your costs because the majority of, the biggest factor in dredging costs is plant. How much plant, how many boats, how many vessels, how many gas tanks they have to fill up, right? And that fuel cost really is what's driving up the cost. So that's affected by the proximity to the beach area. It's affected by protection from offshore waves. So if you're way out there in the ocean and it's winter time, that's gonna slow you down, it's gonna increase risk, that's gonna drive up cost as well. Your accessibility of equipment, how easy it is to get to the dredge. Again, you need a crew boat if it has to run far offshore. That's more fuel versus it has to go somewhere like the river. And then your sediment quality. So as you can probably see here, I'm lobbying for the river. It's closed, it's protected. We need less pipe, we need less fuel to use that source, so it's a lot more affordable. So let's actually look at how affordable it is. So here's a comparison. On the left side here is taking sand from the river. That's how much it cost us in 2018 and 2023-24 for those projects, compared to the Rocks project from offshore in 2014. So not only was it more expensive, it was crappy, right? It wasn't even good sand. So
It's everywhere.
the bottom line cost, there where you see the total cost, it cost us 17 million to use the river in 2018, 23 million to use it in 2023, 24, versus the over 30 million for the offshore sand, and that cost is up to about 50 million under today's scenarios.
When you go total cost with parentheses 23 million, why is that in parentheses?
That's for the 2023 renourishment, so that's we've used the river twice, those are the two.
And are those constant dollars or are those? Relative to-
Those are relative to the year of expenditure.
Wow, so that's really good.
Very
So
good.
it's more than just percentage.
Absolutely. It's,
And the river keeps replenishing sand coming down,
yeah,
so
not only
there's
is
still
it
more
the
to
river, the
use
sand
later.
is compatible, it's the same sand that was addressed on our beach 2 years ago, right? But it's renewable, whereas the offshore borrow areas get dredged and then they're not there, they're gone, they're done.
What's
And
when
once
you
you're
say when
committed,
it's
you're
just-
committed, correct? So when all the rocks started showing up, there was no way to turn back.
That's right. No.
Yeah.
And so this picture was taken in
That
2020.
was, where do I remember that?
That project was pumped up in 2014, right? So you're committed and
Yeah.
you're stuck with it, right?
That
These
was
things just did
half.
not go away. So we're big fans of using the cheaper renewable river sand here, but it was a challenge. So going back to the river was hard and not allowed because of another federal agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, has what's called a COBRA zone. You may have heard this term, Coastal Barrier Resource Act, COBRA. So this was a great law, along with reducing ill-advised beachfront development. This says hey, natural areas shouldn't be developed. We're not gonna supplement you with flood insurance if you go build a house in a natural area. That's kind of the premise of COBRA, right? It's to preserve the natural parts of our coastline so they don't become developed. Well, as you can see, we have a COBRA zone there in the Folly River, and one of the things that the COBRA Act doesn't allow is federal expenditures, right? That's why you can't have supplemental flood insurance, and you can't get a government dredge to go in there and do work. So the COBRA zone has kept us out of the river for many years, and we've gotten exemptions, we've had special cases, the president has written letters, we've been able to get in there. But we worked very hard over the course of from about 2018, when we got that exemption, to 2024. There's actually a new federal law passed, and Folly Beach is now forever exempt from the COBRA zone, and we can go back to the river without a fight. So this is a huge win for the city. We don't have to be forced to go out for rocky sand if the Army Corps says so, right? It's like, this is our source now, and it's undeniable, and it's not illegal anymore.
That's awesome.
Which politicians helped get that law passed?
We worked with Nancy Mace's office, helped with it. We have 7 communities nationwide, a few in New Jersey, 3 in North Carolina, and us that all have this challenge. So we all work together. Congressman David Rouser from North Carolina was probably the main driving force there.
Thanks.
Dr. Elko has been pretty prominent in that process, by the way.
Thanks.
So then the last thing related to the federal project and big wins for us, so we mentioned that we have a new 50-year project. So this not very remarkable looking piece of paper is a chief's report that was signed in 2021. We went through the process of redesigning the Folly Beach Army Corps of Engineers project for another 50 years. Some of the projects were expiring, a lot of hurricanes happened, and we got funding to do this. So we said, well, let's go ahead and do it. Our project was set to expire anyway. And the project has now been reauthorized. And the huge win here is that not only did we get the project for another 50 years with that favorable cost share, the cost share in this new study is actually increased to 90% federal and 10% not federal. So it's a huge win. It was a lot of work to get us to where we did, and I'm really proud to say that we have that part of our beach management process in place for the next 50 years. Okay, so when you do beach renourishment, I think I've already impressed upon you that the point of putting sand on the beach is not where it is not all there is. There's a lot that happens on the front end between funding and authorizations and studies, but there also a lot has to happen afterward. So we're required to do all of this monitoring during and after construction, depending on where you are. The sea turtles. We're looking out for all sorts of things. I've got manatees on here, but we have to look for right whales and other wildlife. You probably know there's a lot of turtle monitoring that goes on. Turtle nests are often relocated by the turtle team. During construction, they're actually not just maybe moved up the beach like they would be on a normal day, but they're taken from wherever they might be deposited down to a part of the beach that won't be renourished. And then the other part of monitoring is that we monitor the physical characteristics of the beach. So this is something that I do for the city. Along the South Carolina coast, they have these lines that are spaced out every 500 to 1,000 feet, and we go back every year, right before hurricane season, and we measure the elevation. So those profiles that you saw, the cross sections of the beach, we have these very frequently along Folly, and we can tell you the condition and the performance of the beach at any time. It helps with our collaboration with the federal government. We can say, hey, the beach is eroded, you know, we really need to be thinking about renourishment in the next year or two, and we have all that information in our hands. So it does give us a bit more control versus the way we were doing things 15 years ago, which is just letting the Corps tell us when it was time for renourishment. Now we tell them when it's time.
Is that where are those monuments and that you're doing grade?
Yes, maybe you've seen the steel
Yeah.
discs.
So how far offshore do you?
We go about 1,500 feet offshore or to 14 feet below sea level, whichever comes first.
Okay.
When did y'all start doing that?
So the state has been recording this since the 80s, so some of the lines go back that long, but the city, we've been doing this since the 2014 project. All right, we talked about dunes and how they form scientifically, but let's talk a little bit about management of dunes. So we've already mentioned that dunes are features of the wind and they don't do well under extreme erosional situations. They need that time to recover. The third bullet, they're stable only in areas that aren't regularly reworked by waves. And the second to the last one is one I really want to make sure you read, and that is dunes are not necessarily vast reservoirs of sand. Some people think that it's like the storage bank for the beach. The volume of the dune is much, much less than the volume of the whole beach. And remember, we have about 2/3 of the beach underwater, so the dune is just a small part of that. And they're just not effective protection from long-term erosion. They're going to get eroded over time. This is a 1999 photo of a dune scarp at Caswell Beach, North Carolina, and you can see the dune is no match for their long-term erosion. Dunes became front-page news during the passage of Hurricane Sandy and the impact that it had on New Jersey. So the scientific news story was that the dunes protected the towns from Hurricane Sandy. There were pictures that I don't have any here with, you know, a septic tank out on the beach in an area where there were no dunes, and then you can see in the background a dune in front of a house that was preserved. So the dunes were really the part of the project that became more important and more of a focus during this time period. Before that, it wasn't such a big deal. The Folly project was actually designed without a dune. Army Corps just comes in and builds us a beach. Okay, so nowadays the Army Corps is now building beaches and dunes together. And what's really important for us in South Carolina and everywhere is even if we have high dunes, it's those discontinuities in the dune system. You can see the picture there. That's from North Myrtle Beach, taken from the top of one of their towers looking down during Hurricane Matthew. The storm surge didn't overtop the dunes. They would have been fine. They wouldn't have even had any flooding, but it came in on the pedestrian pathways. So this is something that we incorporate in the dune management plan, is to try to get as continuous a line of dunes as possible, and you do that by building dune walkovers, which we'll talk about in a second here. But kind of this is sort of the formula that came out of what we learned from Hurricane Sandy, and it's really simple, and that is wide beaches and high continuous dunes along with elevated structures are going to give you your best storm damage reduction. Pretty basic to think about, but it's not the way that the Army Corps or other agencies were thinking before that. The dune walkover is what I would like to talk about here. So that's our structure that's going to help us maintain the high continuous dunes. We also use dune vegetation and fencing to trap wind-blown sand. We'll use seedlings of native vegetation and fencing to kind of slow down the wind transport so the sand drops out and the dune can be formed like we discussed earlier. Okay, this is one that's really hard to get across to property owners, and that is where to install your sand fencing or vegetation. So based on this photo, do you think a high dune close to the beach would be more effective, or a smaller dune closer to the property?
I'd go smaller, dune closer.
That's right. So the more landward location, as you can see in the figure caption, it actually could provide equal protection as a larger dune farther out. And that is obviously because of the impact of wave energy. It's not just not in a stable location there out in the middle of the beach. Dune fencing and dune restoration is another component of our projects. It's very detailed and a lot more goes into it than you probably think. So this is a spec from the Army Corps of Engineers Beach Renourishment Project that tells the contractor exactly where to place the fencing and the vegetation so that projects can build the dunes as we've seen them here. So that's the fencing piece. The vegetation piece, we like to use sea oats and bitter panic grass. These are the two that we found are native and they're most resilient to, if wave energy is to impact them in the fair weather storm profile situation, that these will come back and do very well. Okay, so I want to tell a quick story here. So this is, I used to work in Florida and my predecessor would just give out plants to the communities. It's like, here, go plant your sea oats. We're excited to have this program. We're giving out free plants. Well, this particular community hired a landscape engineer. He made these beautiful pathways with the vegetation. He put in little irrigation pipes, right? But obviously, you can see the beach eating away at the vegetation there. So this is improperly placed dune vegetation. We don't want to put our dune vegetation out on the beach. So in this situation, this is a renourishment project in place. We're getting ready, okay, we're gonna give our plants out again to the people, but this time we're gonna tell them where to put them, right? So we have the position of eroded shoreline. That's where, as you can see down the beach, that's where the beach was prior to renourishment. So where are you gonna tell the people to put the plants this time? Behind the line, right? Put them in the part of the beach that's not gonna be impacted by wave energy. Okay, so pretty simple, but you know, you would think that people would get this, but you gotta teach it. You have to tell them that that's what you need to do. And then finally, last one here would be dune walkover. So the purpose here is to provide access to the beach and to balance the pedestrian traffic and sediment supply. So what do I mean by that? So if you're walking up to the beach, you're gonna head out there, how are you going to get to the beach if this is what you're faced with? Where will you walk out to the beach?
Right through the little part.
Right through the little hole, right? And over time, it looks like that, right? With no dune walkover. So now you have this. This is your coastal management challenge. I'd like to fix this problem. What should I do? How do I fix that?
Dune walkover.
I build a dune walkover, but not that one. Right? That's just in a funnel storm surge. We see this all over. This is a very common thing that cities will do. So again, just another thing here. We don't want to build structures like this. We want to go up and over our dunes. This is an appropriate dune walkover, and that's how we sustain that continuous line of dunes.
So walk
along
over,
the
not
beach.
through.
Over, but not through. Exactly. All right, so where are we? I have 3 more slides, so we're doing okay. Thank you for bearing with me. We had that spectrum of tools for beach preservation. We had hold the line on one end, and we had do nothing on the other end. So I want to talk just for a minute here about retreat, which is something that we hear a lot about in South Carolina, not so much on Folly Beach. But for many years, the state actually had a policy, a 40-year policy of retreat. And that's, a lot of great things came from it. The jurisdictional lines that are updated every 7 years and that move are part of that. But places like Folly got really angry, even if they heard the word retreat. And this is common with communities like ours around the nation. Like, we're not retreating, we have a project, we're allowed to have seawalls, like we're staying right here, obviously. Where are we gonna go? We can't retreat, right? This is it. But what I want to tell you is that Folly is practicing managed retreat. All of the things that are recommended under the managed retreat guidelines are things that we're doing. So coastal management planning, setback lines, preventing private coastal armoring, well, not doing that, but the rest of South Carolina is. Rebuilding restrictions, right? If something is damaged more than 50%, you don't rebuild it. And buyout programs, which we just talked about. Let's get all those parcels in the public trust. So there are lots of examples of retreat. I talked about the Galveston seawall that was built in the 1900s. That whole community just went up. They elevated their town and put a seawall out in front of them. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, you can see the picture there on the screen. It was moved back, what was it, like 3,000 feet back in around 2000, right? It was so like the Morris Island Lighthouse that got stranded out to sea, that one did too, and they retreated it. So these are, this is another tool that we are implementing here on Folly. It's part of the beach preservation spectrum, and FEMA is also the final federal agency that I want to mention. They do have some hazard mitigation assistance programs. The city's taking advantage of many of those, and one of them is to help elevate homes. So that's that last part of the equation. Wide beaches, high dunes, and elevated structures are really going to be your formula for coastal resilience and beach preservation. If any, I'll give you these slides. There's a lot of little tidbits in here. This is a video that FEMA put out about how the Keys, it's the other story, how the Keys have become very resilient over time. So they went from like mobile homes to elevated structures and then adding some other features. And so how kind of they increase their resilience through building codes. Okay, this is the conclusion here, a final recap of the erosion management spectrum. So, as I mentioned, in South Carolina, the beachfront communities aren't just picking one tool anymore. They're not saying like, okay, we have a renourishment project, we're good. They're utilizing all of the things along this spectrum. And I would say that Folly Beach is doing this extremely well and using all of the tools here. I have these slanted words that say hybrid projects, and this is when we combine a lot of these different concepts. So we talked about the buried seawall. So most of the places that I'd like to take you now out onto the beach are going to be places like the county park, where there's a terminal groin, there's a beach nourishment, there's a dune vegetation, dune fencing. So we're combining a lot of the different tools along this spectrum. Other areas, we have buried seawalls, so you can see all of these things in play, the revetment at the washout. So we're not just using one of the tools, but we're creating these hybrid projects and utilizing all the tools in the toolbox. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so I think I got this straight. The critical baseline is you can't build past it. There's
Right.
other lines, but that's what's important.
That's right.
If the building is to repair 50% more of the value, you cannot repair it, it comes down. So versus 50%, on the other side, if the FEMA got to raise up the code, different 50% rule. Does that make sense?
Different 50%, correct.
Okay. And there's also a dune management line, which is at the setback line.
It's 40 feet back from the baseline.
Okay,
Yes,
so that's 40
and it's a
feet.
that's a locally drawn line.
I've been so confused about the critical baseline, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll create another one of these cross sections that has all the lines on it. We'll go across the whole island and show the beach and the marsh so everyone can.
I feel like a light bulb's
Yeah.
turned on for me. Thank you very much.
There's also like a critical area the state has between the perpetual easement line maybe and the primary dune line now.
Yeah, that's very
Another
confusing.
little- Yeah.
Okay, so y'all tell me, what are we up for?
There's
I
lines.
can,